Most organizations start their ERP implementations before they're ready. They rush into the projects and are playing catch up throughout the implementation. And this is one of the primary reasons why projects fail. The projects that are most successful, on the other hand, are the ones that are fully prepared and are ready for the change. Now, how do we know if we're ready for our ERP implementation, and how do we know when it's time to really start the implementation? I'm going to talk about that here in today's video. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. When we're working with organizations, we oftentimes run into companies that want to just jump right in and start their implementations. They've selected the software that they've decided to move forward with, or maybe it's multiple softwares. They have a plan to move forward. They've signed the contract with the software vendor. And generally, momentum and morale and excitement is at a high at that point. At the point you've selected the software and at the point you're ready to start the implementation, that is one of the peak moments of excitement and momentum in the project. So it can be very easy to just jump right in and start doing stuff, to start implementing and to start making progress and seeing actionable steps, which is a good thing, but it can also lead to a dark side. The dark side of that is that companies are oftentimes not fully prepared and they don't have their ducks in a row or key decisions made that are critical inputs into making your implementation as successful and as effective and efficient as possible. So as an example, a lot of times companies spend a lot of their time early in an implementation making decisions around what they want to be when they grow up. But in the meantime, you have a room full of system integrator resources. They're billing by the hour, and the meter's running while you're trying to make some of these key decisions. So oftentimes that dynamic can lead to cost overruns, or in other cases, it can also lead to misalignment in the decisions that are being made because we've rushed into a decision because we know the meter's running and we have to hit our key milestones in order to be efficient. So that whole dynamic is exactly what we're trying to avoid, and that dynamic is what can be mitigated via a more effective implementation readiness phase of a project, and that's what I want to talk about here today. When we look at implementation readiness, there are 5 major work streams that we typically help our clients through, and we recommend that companies go through to get ready for their implementation. And the first is executive alignment. And this is a really important step that a lot of companies don't think about, or they oversimplify by assuming that because our executives approved the project and they've signed off on the dotted line and they've given us the budget and the resources we need to move forward, they inherently think that that leads to or is an answer for executive alignment. And that is simply not true. There's a lot that goes into executive alignment, and a lot of executive misalignment gets exposed during the implementation if we haven't adequately addressed those issues. So the executive alignment workstream is intended to mitigate some of that risk and really help work through some of the misalignment that every organization has and every executive team has. We need to make sure we get those team members on the same page so that we can better articulate for the rest of the organization what this transformation means. And as we are moving forward with the project team, we can ensure that we're doing so in a way that is aligned with what the executives want. But we can't do any of that until we get that executive alignment. Now, there's 3 primary components of executive alignment. The first is education. The first is to make sure that executives understand what this project really means, what ERP and HCM implementations in general look like, and just really have a realistic view of what to expect. One of the biggest problems we find with ERP implementations is that unrealistic expectations lead to bad decisions later on downstream. So the better we can mitigate that risk and have a realistic view of what the project's going to look like, what is expected of the organization, how much time it's really going to take, how much money it's really going to take, and set aside the overly optimistic sales spin that we've received during the sales cycle of our purchasing decision, the better off we're going to be. So education is a first step, making sure that executives understand what these projects will look like and what to expect in these projects. The second thing that's important for executive alignment is decision making. So there are key decisions that need to be made to help set the parameters or the guardrails for what the project needs to be, what it needs to look like. We need to give clear direction as executives to the project team so that they're not shooting in the dark or relying on misnomers like best practices or industry accelerators or things that aren't necessarily aligned with what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. So we need to define as an executive team what it is that we need to decide to make sure that we are all singing from the same choir book, so to speak. Now, I recently posted a video exactly on this topic, and I've included a link to that video below. So I encourage you to check that out, because in that video, I unpack some of the different dimensions of executive alignment and some of the decisions that need to be made in helping provide a framework to facilitate that entire process. Now, the third component of executive alignment is communications. So once we have executive alignment, we need to start a communication and marketing campaign internally that's coming from the executive team and setting the vision and the tone for this overall project. And it goes much further and much beyond just saying, we've approved this project, we're going to implement a new ERP or HCM system, here's when we expect to go live. That's part of it, but the other part of the message is describing what this means to the organization, what it means to our overall strategy, what it means to individuals within the organization, what's in it for me. All those sorts of things should start being addressed at the executive level early in the project. So all of those components combined are what constitute the executive alignment component of implementation readiness. And until we do those things, we're not truly ready to start our implementation, and we'd be better off waiting until we have some clarity on those aspects of executive alignment before we move forward. Now, the second component of implementation readiness is operational readiness. And what we mean by this is making sure that we have a clear sense of what our business processes are going to look like as part of this transformation. What do we want to be when we grow up? How should our business model look going forward? What's our target operating model? And one of the big risks and one of the big pitfalls that a lot of companies step into, and a lot of our instincts will lead us to, is to assume that we don't need to do any of that work until we start implementing the software, until we start designing the software that will determine for us how our business processes will look. And that's simply not true. The reason for that is because today's technology is so flexible and there's so many different ways to handle even the simplest of workflows that we need to have a pretty good sense of how we want our processes to look in general so that we can give better direction to our system integrators and we can have a better intent on how we're going to design the software to align with what we want our processes to be. Now, having said that, we want to make sure that we start our business processes and define those business processes only to the level of detail that isn't dependent on the type of software that we're using or is not dependent on the design of the actual software. So in other words, we want to define what our processes should look like globally across multiple locations in general in terms of how information will flow, not necessarily what keystrokes and transactions and screens we're going to complete on a system, because that's getting into the design of the software. What we're talking about here is understanding what our procurement approval processes should be, or how we want to align or create common business processes across disparate operations across multiple locations. Those types of decisions should really be made early on because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, if we wait until the software design phase of the project, we're making decisions and we're taking the time to make those decisions while the meter is racking up dollars and time on the actual implementation design of the technology. So the better job we can do defining that stuff up front, the better use we're going to make of the system integrators later on, and the better use we're going to make of our resources later on. So it's one of those situations where you may feel like you're slowing things down, but you do need to slow down in order to speed up later and speed things up overall in the grand scheme of things. Now, I recently posted a video on my YouTube channel that talks exactly about how to handle process mapping and how not all business processes are treated equally. Some business processes are going to go into more detail, other processes are going to go into less detail and defer more to the software. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but you do want to make sure that you go through the process to define those processes to some level of detail to provide that blueprint or a starting point for how the software design will work later on. And I've included a link to that video below, by the way, if you'd like to dive into that a little bit more in terms of understanding how do we handle business processes within our implementation. And finally, but certainly not least important, we also want to do a gap analysis as part of our process definition. So part of the value of defining what our future state processes are going to be is that we start to create an inventory or start to capture from a change management perspective how processes are going to change and how people's jobs are going to be affected. The sooner we can do that, the sooner we can get started on our change management activities, which means the sooner we're going to be able to implement the technology successfully. So completing that gap analysis should also be an important part of that operational readiness workstream. Now, the next thing we need to do as part of our implementation readiness is to get a handle on what our change management strategy and plan should be. Until we have a change management strategy and plan, we don't really know how long our implementation is going to take, because it doesn't matter how long we can deploy technology. What really matters is how long will it take to deploy technology in a way that's going to be used by people and enabled by people. So we have to have a change management strategy and plan in place. And in order to get that change management strategy and plan, we need to understand the lay of the land of the organization. We need to understand the culture, how it compares to other organizations and implementations they've gone through, and also where we expect the pockets of resistance to come from. Because it's not a matter of, are we going to experience resistance? We will experience resistance no matter who we are as an organization. It's just a matter of how severe is the resistance, where are those pockets of resistance, what parts of the organization are going to be more resistant, and what are the root causes of those areas of resistance. And the way we do that in the starting point during the implementation readiness phase is to do an organizational readiness assessment and really look at measuring and benchmarking how our organization compares to other organizations, so that we can create a very prescriptive and tailored change management strategy and plan that fits exactly who you are and who you're trying to be. I can give you all the generic one-size-fits-all playbooks in the world, but they're not going to be relevant to you unless I understand who you are and assess who you are in doing that. And so that's one thing our team does very well, is helping clients understand how ready are they, where are those pockets of resistance, and what is that change strategy and plan that's going to make the most sense for you as an organization based on who you are and where you're headed. In addition to the organizational readiness assessment, the other component of change management as it relates to the implementation readiness phase is getting a handle on how people's jobs are going to change. And I mentioned just a moment ago that the operational readiness work stream is an important input into the change impact assessment, which is an important input into the change management strategy and plan, so that we can start to define how people's jobs are going to change, what we expect their roles to be going forward. If there are major changes that we know are going to happen as a result of this implementation, for example, moving to a shared services model, we want to take our HR department or our procurement department and consolidate that function into one shared service model. That's a pretty big change, and if we're making that sort of change, we want to start on that now. We need to start figuring out how are we going to roll out those changes, because by the time you roll out technology is going to quickly catch up to where we are in terms of determining where our organization is headed. So in other words, the critical path of our implementation and the ultimate determinant of how long our implementation is going to take is going to be dependent on how long it takes us to make those organizational changes. So the sooner we can get started on that, the sooner we're going to finish our overall implementation. Now, while the overall transformation is and should be more of a business transformation and a business initiative rather than a technology initiative, we still have to worry about our technical group, our internal IT department, our internal IT infrastructure. We have to understand the lay of the land of what those things are and what they need to become in order to support the overall transformation. And there's really two layers of this. One is the actual physical infrastructure of the IT function within your organization. So for example, we want to look at the architecture. How will the core ERP or HCM system tie into other technologies? What is the data migration plan? How are we going to migrate data from disparate locations and disparate systems, clean it up and map it in a way that gets us to where we need to be in a sort of a consolidated ERP or HCM system? Those things take time, they take effort, and they're things that we need to start early on to make sure that we're getting a head start on our implementation. Now, it's easy to think that we're implementing a single ERP system, so we don't need to worry about architecture because it's cloud-based and we're going to try and do everything within the ERP system, so why worry about architecture? Well, the reality is that most organizations we work with have some sort of interface or some sort of touch point with other systems, whether it be regulatory systems or best-of-breed type options or bolt-ons that address deficiencies or gaps in the ERP system. With the advent of Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 and shop floor automation and things like that, it's creating even more of a need for good architecture and integration, even if you're leaning on having a single ERP system be kind of the core of your back office operations. It's still very important to think through that architecture. And most, if not all, organizations have trouble or issues they've got to deal with on their data side of things. So getting a head start on the data migration plan and understanding what is the breadbox, how complex or dirty is the data, how long is that going to take us, how much time and money is that going to take us? Those things we need to understand before we can truly have a good understanding of what our implementation is going to look like And the sooner we can get started on those critical path activities, the better off we're going to be. Now, the second component of the technical readiness work stream is the organizational infrastructure. So making sure that we've got the right skills and competencies and capabilities within our IT department to support whatever technology we're deploying. For a lot of organizations, they're making a massive change or a massive shift in technology direction by moving to the cloud from on-premise, by completely shifting software vendors. So if we're moving from SAP to Microsoft or Oracle to Epicor or to Workday, whatever the case may be, those are big shifts, and it requires different competencies and skills than what we've seen in the past. So we need to really look at our IT department and make sure that we understand what it is we need their capabilities to look like and how we can lean on the IT department to be partners in this transformation so that we're not overly dependent on our system integrator to bring those functional and technical resources. So the better we can provide that competency internally, start to get the IT department trained and developed in a way that's going to better support our implementation, the better ownership we're going to have of the project, the less dependent we're going to be on the system integrator, and ultimately the faster and cheaper we're going to end up implementing the solution. Now, the fifth important component of implementation readiness is project governance. And this is where we take control of our implementation. We don't let someone else control the implementation. We don't assume the system integrator or the vendor are going to make decisions for us or tell us how we should run our project. We are going to own that. We are going to determine what the program management plan looks like and how we mitigate risks and how we make decisions that need to be made as part of the implementation. But we can't do any of that unless we've got a solid project governance structure in place, and too many organizations jump past this phase of the project and just jump right into implementation without taking that control early on. Now, there's a few different layers of project governance that I'll highlight a few here. One is defining roles and responsibilities. Who's responsible for what? What do we want to be responsible for as an organization? What do we want to lean on the system integrator for? And who are the individuals that are going to be helping in these different work streams that we're working on? So that's one thing, is what are the roles and responsibilities and individuals that are going to be involved in the project. The second is to create a complete implementation plan. And what I mean by that is generally vendors and system integrators are giving you a piece of the implementation plan, but they're not giving you the complete implementation plan. And the reason for that is because the vendors and system integrators are focused on configuring and building software. They're not focused on typically organizational change management or data migration or helping define what your business processes are going to look like. Those are all things that you're going to be responsible for that need to happen as part of the transformation. And you want to make sure you build that into the plan so that you think of it as more of an overall program with multiple work streams, multiple parties, and people helping you through the project. Your system integrator and vendor is certainly one important part of that, but there's probably going to be other internal resources and maybe even other third-party resources that'll help you through the different components of things that the system integrator is not going to do for you. And finally, an important part of the project governance work stream is risk mitigation. And even though we haven't started the implementation yet, we should have a laundry list going of potential risks and issues that we've got to deal with. We should know enough about the potential resistance that we expect to see, or the time pressures that we're under, or resource constraints. Every organization has risks that should be identified even before you start the implementation. And if you haven't done that yet, I would consider that a big warning red flag. You should have some risks identified. You should be actively mitigating those risks. And if you haven't, the good news is you have time to call a timeout and make sure you get ready and make sure that you do a proper risk assessment so that you can mitigate those risks. If you haven't identified them yet, they're going to sneak up on you and throw you off base later on. So you're a lot better off identifying and tracking those risks now, starting to mitigate them before you get full steam ahead in with your system integrator and into execution mode. So determining whether or not you're ready for your implementation is more art than it is science. There's no magic answer or milestone you can hit that says, yes, we are ready to start. But what we found is that most organizations err way too far on the side of starting prematurely rather than waiting to at least get some of these work streams in progress that we talked about. So the graphic that I've shown throughout this video that highlights those 5 work streams and kind of that overall plan of when those activities should happen may take anywhere from a few weeks for some smaller organizations to several months to some larger organizations. And even once you get to the end of that stage, you're never going to feel 100% ready, and there's going to be a lot of things you're still working on or developing within those work streams. but at least you've started on it, and you're a lot further ahead by spending that time up front getting that stuff in place before you jump too far ahead into the implementation. And as I mentioned before, we have to slow things down to speed things up later on and longer term. And the better job we do during implementation readiness, the better job we're going to do in the overall implementation, because it sets the tone for the overall transformation and gives us control and allows us to have more of a deliberate approach to how we implement technology and manage the overall transformation. So I hope you found this information useful. I've included some helpful links below, some videos and other resources related to this topic that I think will help you, so I encourage you to check that out. I also invite you to please subscribe to my channel, provide any comments you have too, anything that you've experienced in getting ready for your implementation, or perhaps you're in the middle of an implementation or you've been involved in the past with implementations. Hope you found this information useful and have a great day.